Hello, my creative friends. This is Heather North from heatherscreativeblessings.com here with a very special card for you. I am featured on the Operation Right Home midweek throwdown, so I thought I would make an Operation Right Home card in honor of that. And this is in response to Sandy Allnock's Scarf Challenge. I'll have links below for you. Go to my blog, check them out, and you can see what it's all about. But basically I wanted to create my own watercolor background based on the colors of the scarf. So I've got my clear block and I've pulled in some Daffodil Delight, and here I'm using Crisp Cantaloupe, both by Stampin' Up. And then I'm going to pull in just a little bit of this Stampin' Up! Calypso Coral. It's a little bit darker color. The first time I tried this, I had much more Calypso Coral, and it turned the entire piece kind of orange. So when you're working with colors and you want the lighter one to show through, just make sure you have a lot more of that lighter color. I'm going to pull in a piece of paper towel just to protect my work surface a little bit more, and I've got this little spritzer bottle. I'm just going to spritz this block a few times to get the ink kind of moving and flowing on my clear block, and then I'm just going to turn it around, stamp it upside down right on my cardstock. Smush it a little, get the colors moving. I have a lot of water on there, which you can see makes the ink kind of pool to one side, and I'm just going to drip it down. I just wanted to add a darker color where that drips. And then because I'm impatient, I just took my paper towel and I'm dabbing off the excess water. If you can just set it and let it dry, if you do that, you'll have a deeper, darker color. I wanted a little more, I guess, depth, so I'm adding some Crisp Cantaloupe to that clear block again, and I'm just going to spritz it with some more water. I do have a clear plastic on top of my grid mat. I got it from the sewing aisle at my local craft store, so it's not being, that water's not directly on paper right now. But I do have to take a paper towel to kind of clean things up, or I'll have just a wet mess all over the place. I'm sopping up the rest of that excess water, and then I'm going to take a baby wipe just to make sure that I have all the ink off of my clear block and my plastic sheet. You can just set the piece aside to dry, but I wanted to speed up the process a little bit, so I pulled in my heat gun and I'm just heat setting this watercolor piece. Now that my piece is dry, I'm going to grab my embossing buddy and just rub it all over this piece. And that removes any static, plus if there's a little bit of dampness somewhere, that'll keep it pretty dry. The stamp set I've chosen is Hello Darling by Stampin' Up. I'm going to take the largest flower from this set, and I'm going to stamp it in Versamark. I pulled in my foam mat to make sure I get a good crisp image. I've got a little bend in my table, so when I stamp here I have to make sure I have something underneath it. I am, like I said, inking it up in Versamark and just kind of putting one in each corner. I'm turning it as I go to make sure the same image isn't in each spot. I keep my clear embossing powder in one of these plastic containers. I'm just going to scoop up the clear embossing powder and sprinkle it over that Versamarked image, and you'll see that the Versamark picks up the powder. After the entire piece has that embossing powder, I'm just going to flick off the excess. Now I'm bringing in my heat tool and I'm just going to heat set that embossing powder, and you'll see it melt and turn kind of shiny, and that's how you know you've got it properly done. I wanted the flowers to show up just a little bit more, so I'm taking that Crisp Cantaloupe ink and one of my sponges, and I like to just tap off to make sure that I don't get a big smoosh of ink. But then I'm going to rub that ink over where I have embossed, and you'll see the flower start to kind of pop out as the embossed piece resists the ink. I'm going to take now the Daffodil Delight and go over the yellow parts. And then I took my spritz bottle and I just lightly spritzed once, maybe twice, and this gets the colors just flowing a little bit more. Again, you can just let it dry on its own to get a darker color, or you can do what I'm doing and just dab off the excess water. I'm rubbing the excess ink off of the embossed area. I should have done that before I spritzed, but sometimes you just got to go with when you remember. At this point, you can just leave the piece to dry. But again, I wanted to get this done for the video, so I am taking my heat tool and I'm just lightly drying that water that I put on there. Right now my background piece looks a bit like a hot mess. So I'm going to take these dies, they're stitch rectangle dies from Little Inker Designs, and I'm just going to choose a portion of that piece that I've created. And I'm going to cut it out with my Big Shot. I just love the results I get with these dies. Perfect rectangle each time, and they have the little stitch lines, which I think is just a nice, cute detail. You could take the next size up and cut your mat with the black cardstock, but I decided to just take my cardstock and cut it 1/4 of an inch bigger to create my mat. For the sentiment, I'm going to use a scrap from another card I made recently. I cut out the tag, you can see it here on this card, and I just love the scrap so much that I couldn't throw it away. So I again have the Hello Darling stamp set from Stampin' Up, and I'm stamping the sentiment in black StazOn ink. There it is, Hello Darling. I'm going to cut out the sentiment with this embellished tag from Mama Elephant. It has stitching lines just like the die I used previously. Can you tell I love those stitching lines? I'm going to run it through my Big Shot again. And then I'm going to cut my mat out of black cardstock with the same die. My two tags are now the same size, so I'm just going to take some sharp paper snips and I'm cutting right on the stitch lines to cut out my tag. This will make it into a nice mat on the background. But after I cut it out, I decided I really didn't like the little knobby edges I could see. So I came back in with my scissors and trimmed it down just a little bit more, just inside those stitch lines, so I would have a smooth line. I love to color, so I decided to color in those little flowers and leaves that are on the tag. I pulled in some Crest Cantaloupe again, and I just squeezed the lid to get a little bit of ink into the lid. And now I'm going to use my blender pen to color in the flowers. To get color into the lid of my ink pad, I just squeeze it together when it's slightly open, and there you see a bunch of ink pulled into the lid of my ink pad. I clean off my blender pen in between each color by just scribbling off on a piece of scrap paper. See, there I am squeezing again, pulling in some Calypso Coral to add some shading to those flowers, and also just as the little dots in those little flowers. Clean off my blender pen, make sure it's nice and clean, and then for the leaves I'm going to pull in Wild Wasabi, and that's the color I used on the tag previously, so it'll bring in just a little bit more of that green. I went back and pulled a little more color to add just a little bit of darkness and shading, and again I'm cleaning it off. This is the fun part where this card starts coming together. I'm using Stampin' Up! Fast Fuse to adhere my card, and oops, I ran out of adhesive, so I need to put in a refill. You guys are going to get to see how to refill this new adhesive from Stampin' Up! It's actually pretty easy. You just pull the top and bottom apart, and you take the refill cartridge and you drop it right in where the old one was. Snap the lid back on and you're ready to go. Of course, I snapped it on top of my sticky piece, but whatever. Okay, So now I'm just adhering the top layer to my my tag, lining it up with those the stitch lines. To use the fast fuse, you're going to pull the tape towards you, stop, and flick it to the side. So pull, stop, flick. Pull, stop, flick. And this separates the adhesive from the backing that's on your fast fuse. I use a lot on this piece because I did watercolor and the water tends to warp the cardstock. It is a very thick cardstock. It's I believe it's a Basil cardstock that I used here, but it still had a little bit of bend to it, and I wanted to make sure it stayed flat on my project. So I'm just adding an extra strip here to the center, and I'm going to adhere that to the center of my card base. I'm using some Stampin' Dimensionals from Stampin' Up! To pop up my card. I like to add lots, not just to make sure it sticks, but also to make sure that it stays popped up wherever I place it. With that embossed background, you have a little bit of leeway if you don't push down to move it because it doesn't stick the same. So I set it on the center and then I just moved down to the bottom. And that is my card for the Scarf Challenge. Thank you, Operation Right Home, for all that you do for our heroes and for asking me to be a part of your midweek throwdown. It's been a pleasure and an honor. I hope that all of you find some time today to get a little bit creative and perhaps make a card for Operation Right Home and our heroes. Bye!